You're listening to the Book Talk Today podcast, a podcast that inspires readers to obtain valuable insights to inform, educate, and improve lives. My name is Orn Abdi. I'm an avid reader, best known for the creation of the 1 Minute Book Review community, and I'm sitting down with authors to delve deeper into the books they have written to uncover the story behind the story. Hello listeners, and welcome to another episode of the Book Talk Today podcast. Today's episode is with Matt Burgess on artificial intelligence, and followers of my 1 Minute Book Review channel will know that I have been reading widely on artificial intelligence over the past couple of months. Reading books by Max Tegmark and Nick Bostrom has really illuminated me to different ideas within artificial intelligence and what that might mean, not only for us individuals, but society as a whole. Matt and I had a wonderful conversation, and I'm looking forward to share that with you today. I hope you enjoy it. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 22 of the Book Talk Today podcast. Today, we are joined by Matt Burgess. Matt is the Deputy Digital Editor at Wired, covering cybersecurity, big tech, and everything in between. And today, we'll be discussing his book, Artificial Intelligence, How Machine Learning Will Shape the Next Decade. Matt, it's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much for having me.
So artificial intelligence, or AI as it's widely known, has been a source of fascination for me for the past couple of months. It seems like the books that I'm reading, whether it's Life 3.0 by Max Tegmark or Superintelligence by Nick Bostrom, it seems like, for me anyway, it seems like there's a lot of books out there at the moment, even videos and obviously articles as well. I'm sure for Wired magazine is the same, talking about artificial intelligence. So I thought a great place to start would be, how do you define artificial intelligence or AI, and why is it something that all of us need to be cognizant of with its progress?
Yeah, that is a really good question. So AI itself, or the idea of AI, has been around for like 70 odd years now. It was sort of first coined as a term in the 1950s, and obviously things have moved on a lot since then. The general idea of AI itself is that it is something that is something that's done by a machine that can be to some extent intelligent. But there are big questions around sort of the real definition of this, though. Depending on who you speak to, the word intelligence will mean lots of different things, and also sort of the level that a machine has to be able to do something that is autonomous, that it can do it on its own, is something that is also hotly debated. But I think that the real sort of aim of the field and the goal of AI is to recreate sort of human behaviors by machines, that we're not telling them exactly what to do. So it's not something that is programmed. It's not something that you telling machine exactly do this in these steps. It's something that there's a little bit of sort of ingenuity or creativity, or something that is not programmed, essentially. So in short, I guess it is a machine system that can do something by itself.
I think the loaded definition of it is sometimes where people get confused, or where people, for instance, get overwhelmed by what artificial intelligence is, because there's not one clear-cut definition of it. And then in the book, you talk about AGI, which is artificial general intelligence, and sort of adds another layer of complexity to it. With artificial general intelligence, I think it would be good perhaps to just say what artificial general intelligence is, as opposed to just artificial intelligence.
Yeah, so general intelligence, or AGI, is pretty much the big goal of everybody working in AI research. This would be an AI system that is capable of doing anything, basically. So we could say, go and complete these tasks, report back to me, and then it will do that, and then it can easily move on to another task. AGI is often at other times known as a superintelligence or things like that. There's lots of definitions for this, but we're talking the general is the thing that really differentiates it in this phraseology, really, because it's something that can be applied to multiple different tasks. Looking at AI systems in the future, the real goal of lots of researchers is to create something that can do multiple different things without being retold what to do. So the general is a real big sort of word here that is really differentiates it from AI. And the AI systems that we have at the moment can be very good at very specific individual tasks, but they're not general. They can't be applied to something else that they don't already know. I think that is the goals of lots of companies working in this space, particularly sort of DeepMind, which is owned by Google, that they want to create general AI that can be used across multiple different areas. So that's the AGI is really, I guess, the big goal of a lot of the artificial intelligence research.
It seems though that with AGI, there's a lot of people who either think it's just around the corner, or then there's those that think that it's 100 years in the future. Where do you think we sit on that when you spoke to experts on this field? How soon is AGI going to be informing our lives? Let's put it that way.
I think personally, and from sort of the experience of like interviewing lots of experts in the field for this book, I think that the sort of the real big AGI systems that can be sort of all encompassing, doing everything that we like, is still quite a long way off. A lot of researchers, and this is based on other reporting and stuff as well, generally think that AGI could be 30, 40, 50 years away. And I think that is timeframes that we could be looking at. However, it's always dangerous to be making predictions, particularly in sort of the space with how quickly a lot of this technology moves. In the last decade or so, we've seen a lot of progress within AI and sort of how researchers are trying to make it a little bit more general. And some of those breakthroughs sort of came through just because of overall technology progressing, us getting better algorithms and machines and more computing power. And really sort of like the growth in the last 10 years has been huge. So I think that even if we're saying something around AGI could exist in half a century's time, I think that there is still this unknown around it, where if there is a big new breakthrough, it could come sooner, or equally, there could be a time when we realize that actually this isn't something that we can ever really achieve. Like the human intelligence or the human brain is so complex, it's not something that we can fully replicate. Yeah, I would say a long way off, but also add in those caveats that basically I just went through.
It was interesting though, because in the book you were saying about how they first had the concept of at Dartmouth University about artificial intelligence in the 1950s, and then they had this prediction that, you know, in the 70s and 80s there'll be this massive growth, and because there's a lot of money being pumped into it. And then I think you said there was a researcher in the book called Lighthill, I can't remember the first name, but he was basically saying that throughout that time there was so much investment being pumped into it, but there's very little growth. Whereas at the moment, obviously, there's a lot of investment going in and there's obviously growth, but whether that's sort of a linear growth, that's yet to be seen in that way. The interesting thing for me about that general intelligence, or when that's going to come around the corner, is in the book you give the example of AlphaGo. So the example being the game Go, and then the computer beating basically the champion at Go. But the thing that I thought about was that is a defined parameter. It's a game, isn't it? It's sort of, it's enclosed in a box, so to say. But where it comes to human behavior and creativity and making human decisions, it's not very comparable. Would you say that's the case as well?
I think that this is one of the probably the things that people are really grappling with in this space. With Go in particular, yes, it is pretty well constrained, really. There are rules, there are only certain moves you can make. You're talking about the whole world of Go when you're playing it is the board in front of you. There is nothing else. Things outside of that board don't exist, really. And Go was, AlphaGo system was able to beat the best humans at this, and in the process did make some moves that were creative, essentially. So it did things that human players, human experts, the best in the world, would never do, confounded people who are watching who know the game. So it showed a bit of creativity in that respect. But also, as you point out, there are the constraints around the game, and it's nothing that is outside of that. And I think that if you took that AlphaGo system and tried to apply it to something that wasn't a board game, Google has and DeepMind has successfully deployed that system, trained that system on chess and a few other games as well. But if you took that system and tried to get it to understand medical images or something like that, it couldn't do that at the moment. And that's where the sort of idea of going back to AGI and the generality of AI research comes into it. So that's sort of like an example of getting towards the future of AGI, where you take what this AlphaGo system and it can drive a self-driving car, or it can look at medical images, it can do anything. That's where the sort of like the challenge around some of the AI work and development is. And I think that sort of in this space, when you're looking at trying to create something that is a lot more general, that's when things start to get hard. And it's where the real world comes into things as well, because living in the real world, doing anything, going outside, there is an infinite set of probabilities of different events that could happen. You could turn left and walk down the street one way, you could turn right, and everything that is it's a chain reaction. There is stuff that's going on that's you can't control, and sort of getting an AI that can understand that is very, very difficult. Some of the robotics researchers that I was talking to throughout the book as well were also saying that stuff that is very much, when you've got robots and things moving around, that is in in the three-dimensional world. And at the moment, you've got robots that are basically about as capable as toddlers. They can pick up a few items. They might be able to pick up a screwdriver, use AI and machine learning to sort of understand what needs to be screwed. But if various little small things, lighting in the environment or different backgrounds in the environment change, then it can be confounded basically. So I think that's like the real world messiness of things is going to be like one of the big challenges that these systems need to come over when they're not working in sort of purely software environments.
And what you said prior to that was sort of replicating the brain and how difficult it is or will be to replicate the brain, because it's not perhaps just as easy as just having those neural networks and replicating them in the lab. And what I thought about something was very interesting that made me think when I was reading your book was the fact that the brain, or our brains and the way that we live, is parsimonious. So we are affected by our environment and our brain develops in relationship to our environment. However, when you're creating a neural network or like a fake brain, whether if you want to call that, there's no feedback loop in the same way that we have a feedback loop with the brain. So were these scientists suggesting that it will be brain-like or that it will be an exact replica of the brain?
That really depends on, I think, who you talk to. I've said earlier, I think some of the sort of definitions of intelligence and AI and everything is all sort of like hotly debated between people working in this space. And how much a system should look like the brain is one of those questions as well. And I think that when you are looking at some of these challenges, it becomes a lot harder if you're trying to exactly replicate something that is human. And I don't necessarily think that we should try to exactly replicate the brain and all its functionalities, because there are so many things that we just don't understand about how the human mind works at the moment, that trying to actually do those things would be really difficult. But I think one of the things that is worth pointing out about AI and sort of particularly the systems that we have at the moment is it's all based on data that we give to the machines. If you're going to have an AI system that is able to drive a car or something like that, it'll have to learn from previous examples and be fed lots of data. And we're at a stage where there's a lot of AI research at the moment that is throwing huge amounts of data at AI, and that's seeing the AI actually improve by huge amounts as well. And that's one of the big reasons why AI has been having a moment or so for the last few years, because of the amount of data we can train an AI system on. And there is a big question around how much data can you give to a machine and it keep improving and keep learning from. Is there sort of like a finite resource of, yes, we can give it all text from the English language and it will keep improving? Or is there a point where you don't give it all of the text from the English language and it just it plateaus? So there are sort of like questions around that in terms of like, is just giving so much data to a machine going to keep improving things? Whereas with the brain, I think we know that all of our shared experience and learnings makes us more rounded, makes us more human. Whereas with machines, there's still to be seen, I think.
Definitely. The interesting thing that you talked about in the book was the natural language. Is it programming or processing?
Processing. Yeah.
Processing, yeah, exactly. And in the book you were saying like languages like Python are basically like the bedrock of artificial intelligence, and the way that interface is between humans and computers. And like you were saying, it's very much data entry with Python or these interfaces, and then the computer does something with that information. Something that you touched upon in the book was sort of the societal economic impacts of that interface or that processing. Could you just speak to that a bit? What are the potential challenges when it comes to those languages and the implications that potentially that might have? Because in the book specifically, you were talking about data that that these programs are using, artificial intelligence using, they're mapping patterns perhaps in the past where they're not the ideal patterns, let's put it that way, whether they be, ethnic diversity or, suppression of minorities, whatever that might be.
The AI systems that we have at the moment are trained and learn from the data that we give them. If you give a system that is meant to predict crimes, lots of data, it will learn from that data. It doesn't know anything else beyond that data. And if all of that data is biased, if it is looking at areas that are potentially over policed, if there is information that is bad, essentially, that the AI system will repeat this. The systems that we have at the moment are very much learn and train from this data that we give them. So they will repeat whatever is in this data. Obviously, there are huge amounts of problems with society and humans and how we behave to each other. Lots of groups and people that have been either oppressed or had not been treated the same as other groups, etc., whether that is race or gender or lots of any type of diversity, essentially. If those problems exist in data, which we know that they will do, because the human world where we're capturing them from is not perfect and is a mess and needs to be improved in many different ways, that will be replicated in the outcomes that you have. One of the phrases that researchers quite often use is bad data in means you'll get bad results. And that is something that is very true. And that is particularly a concern, I think, for AI. So over recent years, we've seen AI systems that power facial recognition becoming a lot more available and used a lot more in the real world. And these systems have been demonstrated time and time again to produce biased results, but they have been trained more often on images of people with light skin, and they're better at recognizing and detecting accurately people with lighter skin. Whereas in data training sets, there have been cases and research around showing these sorts of discrepancies, really. Part of that is because the data sets that the AI has been trained on haven't been representative of society. They've been because of the data that has been captured. I think that these types of issues are currently being explored in policing and these areas, but there are lots of different areas of society where we need to be careful about the data we're putting into systems and the data that is coming out of them, beyond everything from policing, but where AI could be impacting society in any way, really.
Yeah, part of me feels like it goes above and beyond the actual artificial intelligence, because a couple of episodes ago we had Kinde Andrews, who is a professor of Black Studies at Birmingham University, and he wrote a book called The New Age of Empire, which is about colonialism. And in that book, he talks about white supremacy, and he talks about the fact that there was a system of governance where the suppression of Black and brown people. And in the book, you touched upon that slightly, and you said that there's a system in place that elevates, perhaps, well, I don't know, you didn't say it in the book, this wasn't your opinion, but I can't remember the individual's name that you referenced in the book, and saying that it's more of a system issue to how we see those individuals and those minorities. How do governments and regulatory bodies go about policing that type of data to make sure, policing is probably not the right use of the word, but managing that data to make it seem like, or to push the fact that these AI companies or institutions don't further discriminate between those minority groups?
Yeah, it is a very good question. And I think that is one that governments and lots of groups are currently grappling with. In recent years, there has been a huge increase in the amount of research and funding for AI ethics and AI fairness. And there's a lot of people within industries that are trying to grapple with some of these questions. And I think that is starting to translate to governments and regulatory bodies and things as well. With the law and everything generally, they tend to be a little bit behind the adoption of technology, and the law takes a long time to catch up. So there is not a huge amount of AI specific legislation in anywhere around the world at the moment. And I think that is something that's going to change over coming years. But also, before that sort of happens, before those laws come into place, there needs to be a reckoning in terms of looking at the companies that are producing AI technology and sort of the underlying structures and systems of how it's being produced as well. At a very high level, we know that a lot of the big Silicon Valley technology companies are very white. They are mostly employing people within AI research that have been one group of people, which is white males. That needs to be improved upon, obviously. But I think having sort of diverse perspectives within companies is one step to be able to sort of make sure that the technology is being used properly. But there's also a question and a case for auditing systems. So with facial recognition technology, research from the MIT Media Lab in recent years has the research that I was talking about around facial recognition and finding out that with lighter skin are a lot more accurately detected by it. That sort of research taking place has actually led to the systems being improved upon by the companies. So that's shining a light on this. But I think that there needs to be more resources going into the sort of auditing of these systems, organized and structural level, really. both within companies that are developing the software, but also external bodies. And while it's very good that researchers and academic institutions can do this, I think that we're getting to a stage where AI can be used a lot more in society, that it needs to actually be controlled a lot more by regulators and by groups that can have the power to go into a technology company and say, provide us the data that goes into your system, provide us the source code, provide us the outputs, and give us that overall view. We want to audit it. We want to make sure that it's not breaching qualities laws or legislation or stuff like that. So I think that the approach needs to be sort of multifaceted, but sort of like starting point. The companies that develop this need to take responsibility for it.
It seems as though it's more because in the book you talk about the open letter that Elon Musk and Bill Gates and Stephen Hawking wrote to say that we need to be very careful with AGI and pushing it without having the regulatory framework. So it seems like the big proponents of artificial intelligence or AGI actually pushing governments or pushing institutions to create these regulatory frameworks because they know that if they don't push it now, it's going to come and bite them later down the road. Like you can just look at social media companies right now. If they pushed in the same way, then perhaps they wouldn't be getting that pushback. So is the emphasis on the actual institutions or the companies, or is it on like the government and the regulatory frameworks? And the reason why I bring this one up in particular is going back to the language and the definition, because if there's not a relationship with if they both are not on the same page about the language used, then it's very difficult to come to a consensus.
Because there is this sort of like lack of real understanding of what AI is in some cases, I think that really does make it harder to regulate in some ways and control in some ways. I know that the EU at the moment is currently looking at how it could regulate AI, and that's probably legislation should be happening this year as far as I'm aware. The approach that's taking is looking at systems that could be high risk, and I think that having quite a broad brush approach can potentially be quite useful in these scenarios. I think you're looking at systems that might be automated, even if they might not have AI. One of the big things that happened in the last year or so around the use of automated technologies was in the UK fiasco of the government handing out A-level results to students that were going to university, and they did it in an automated way using an algorithm. That wasn't AI, but the sort of the process that was done, because it was automated, because it was an algorithm, it wasn't sort of something that was AI and wasn't intelligent. But I think that sort of example shows how much misunderstanding there can be around these types of systems, and how sort of the discourse around them can really sort of fluctuate and become something that is maybe not reflective of the technology. But with that example, one of the real important things was how the people at the end of the system, the teenagers that were getting their results and being told this computer says that you can't go to this university because your grade isn't good enough, how they were impacted, how they felt, that sort of end user perspective was the thing that really mattered. And I think that is going to be the case whether it is AI or whether it is something less sophisticated that's involved in decisions about people, whether that's something around financing, policing, loans, renting properties, all these types of areas where people's rights and liberties are sort of touched upon. I think that's a good way to look at sort of like how you control systems that are having an impact and making decisions about people, whether it is, as I say, AI or something that's not quite as sophisticated.
On that point in the book, you touched upon China's system of surveillance and the potential downsides, or the current downsides of having a social credit system like they do in China, and how they are oppressing, whether it is the Uyghurs and tracking them and using drone technology to maintain social distance. I know you talked about India as well, how they send drones up in the sky and then they have like artificial boxes and they make sure that people are staying social distance. How and China, and I didn't know this actually when I read in your book, is China is actually one of the main exporters as well of this technology to Western companies as well. So that's like an added layer of complexity onto this, because the systems that are being developed by a country that is, I wouldn't say have the best human rights record, or perhaps don't have the ethical framework in place when they create these technologies. So where's the difficulty there?
Yeah, I think that surveillance is going to be one of the sort of big boom areas for AI. And it goes back to partly the idea of the sort of data that is going into AI and sort of the amount of data that we're producing as a society, whether it is web browsing or what we do on our phones, or the amount of sort of surveillance cameras and satellites and things like that. That all produces data that can be really useful in some contexts and some scenarios, can sort of help improve sort of efficiency of how we operate as a society. But there's also this risk of increasing increasing surveillance. I've talked about facial recognition, but there's also sort of like the other ideas of how this technology can be used to look at sort of patterns in behavior and overall sort of the ways that we live our lives with the data that we're collecting and putting out there. And when you're getting to a stage of sort of controlling that or trying to limit the sort of harms that could be done through surveillance, I think, again, it's probably very similar in terms of how you look at some of these issues. I think that it needs to be done through sort of like a human rights perspective in many ways. And it isn't necessarily just about the technology. The technology can be used for both good and bad, but the sort of systems and the processes that need to control it need to be things that we probably already understand and can be explained to everybody. And we were talking about sort of creating laws around AI and regulation a little bit, but I think that there is this also debate of like, do we need AI specific laws, or are the existing sort of legal frameworks that we have around qualities and human rights, etc., are they good enough to be able to be applied to new technology? And this isn't something that's probably unique to AI. I'd say that lots of issues with technology and big social media platforms and companies all touch upon these areas as well. And I would like to have like a really good answer that is the way forward. But I think that really the sort of approach to any of these types of emerging technologies is something that is sort of multifaceted. It needs to have people that are making it involved. It needs to have people who aren't making it. It needs to have people who are impacted. It needs to have lawmakers. And there needs to be this well-rounded approach to creating sort of ways to understand and control and benefit from the technologies that we're creating.
The interesting legal framework side of it is very interesting to me, because when I read Life 3.0 by Max Tegmark, and he talks about artificial intelligence in that book, and that's what that book's about. He talks about artificial general intelligence, or the super intelligence, if you want to put it that way, and the fact that, well, if it has the level of human consciousness that a human does, should it have its own set of rights? Should it be somewhat on the same par as a human? Is a human someone who has a body, or is a human just someone who thinks like a, is a human just someone who thinks in that way, or does it have to have this corporeal nature to it? Which I thought was a fascinating analysis of the situation, because it goes beyond just human versus computer. It then poses the question back to humans to say, okay, well, what makes us human?
It does. And I think that looking at sort of some of the ways that AI is developing and seeing, particularly if you're some of the natural language processing technology you can put a few inputs into this and it can produce paragraphs of text that are as good as any human can write, essentially. And that is one of the questions of, do you know that this is something that is being created by a human or an AI? Does that matter? What does it necessarily mean to be human as well? And I think that some of these questions are so challenging that they go into areas of obviously philosophy and all of these different sort of subjects. But I think that there were the questions and debates worth having. For me, I would say that I very much would like to see the way that AI is developing and being used focus on a lot of the problems that we have now and the ways that it's being used now and could be used in the near term. But I'm very much thinking sort of it more from a technological perspective than that sort of like bigger picture question of a few decades down the line or something like that, of what it really means. I think that, it's worth having these debates, but I think within the book, what I was really trying to focus on is what is now, what is coming next, and sort of making sure that we get that right before we even get to anything that could sort of like disrupt society completely.
When you spoke to those experts, what was their major fear when it came to this development? Was it the ethical implications? Was it the fact that perhaps there isn't a charted road in front of us and it could go anywhere? What was some of the main concerns that those experts were thinking?
The amplification of some of the problems that the world has at the moment, inequalities and discrimination amplified by AI and sort of the automated process. Really, I guess, not losing control, because I don't think we're at a stage where AI will sort of lose control, but sort of moving towards a world where we lose some of that control that we have. So if you're working in an organization that is making decisions about people and you're having sort of suggestions put in front of you by a computer all the time, by an AI system, do you how long does it take before you just rely upon those systems and stop questioning whether it is the right thing to do and just completely trusting the machine? I think that those are things that we need to be more aware of and sort of like considering as well, and sort of really having processes in place to be able to sort of like scrutinize the decisions that are being presented to us by an AI or by any sort of computer system, I would say, and keeping humans involved in the process, and understanding sort of everything about what makes society good and great in many ways, and sort of like that understanding of, yes, people are at the heart of this. The technology can do some of the things for you, but at the end of the day, it's people that are impacted by these types of systems and AI. And that needs to be something that's really at the forefront of our minds, I would say.
On the point of jobs and the world of work, I think that's an interesting, it seems to be as if universal basic income and artificial intelligence and the world of work, I see all of just one big conversation, because a lot of the conversations about universal basic income, about the effects of artificial intelligence, what that means for instance, manufacturing workers or drivers, whatever that might be, if we go into sort of a driverless society. And I know you mentioned Emily Bede from the Google Health researcher, who said that designing AI tools with people at the center. And I read a book recently by Daniel Susskind, who's a professor in University of Oxford, and the world at work in that book. And he talks about in there about the fact that when a technology comes, it's not the sense that they are displaced, those workers. New opportunities come for them to learn new skills, and they don't get displaced. When you spoke to experts, did they feel as if the jobs would be displaced, or do they were much more optimistic about a growth in sectors and industries due to this technology?
I'd say that probably a few years ago, when we were sort of seeing some of the big AI hype that's sort of been around recently, there would have been a lot more concern about people losing their jobs because of AI completely. I'd say that the sort of thinking has shifted a little bit now to what you were saying, really, in terms of human will be working alongside AI, and the roles that we do will change. The example that you mentioned there about some of the Google research that was in this space, that was involving using eye scanning technology, looking for problems around sort of diabetes, and that was a trial was being done in Thailand, and that was very interesting because it was one of the first trials of these types of AI technologies in the real world. So Google has made that technology, it's proved that technology can detect problems in the eye. In laboratories, it can do what it's supposed to do. But when you take it into the real world, there was lots of challenges around the space that it was being done in, not being set up for using AI and cameras, bad Wi-Fi connections. But alongside that as well, some of the nurses and people that were conducting these tests said that it changed their jobs. Like, they could get through more patients very quickly when it was working, and the less senior staff were needed to be conducting the tests, which meant that more senior nurses could actually spend more time talking to patients and spend more time dealing with their concerns while the technology was doing its job, essentially. If you take away some of the challenges around sort of like the logistical challenges of it not working, I think that that's like a positive sign about what this type of technology could do. It could, in some cases, allow us to be more human, to have more expertise, and really to sort of like do the things that we're best at doing. And somebody put it quite nicely to me recently, saying that if you can have an AI taking away a third of the most boring work that you do, the things that you do on repeat, could automate or could hand to a machine, pretty much everybody would take that, so they could spend more time focusing on the things that only they can do and only humans can do, and bring in that sort of like creative element to the world, which I think is quite exciting. As I say, there's obviously lots of things that we need to iron out and get right, but I think that the promise of the technology overall is something that is going to bring hopefully a positive to the world.
There's definitely a utopian nature to that claim, isn't there? When it says that, this AI can do all the things you don't want to do, and then you're left to just do the things that you love. And those human creativity elements, like we were saying, the fact that the artificial intelligence we have at the moment won't be able to have that creativity aspect. And in the book, actually, you mentioned a great example of that lawyer who was working and said to himself, look, I shouldn't be doing these low basic admin tasks. And he went to then try and program a system. And he basically came up with the conclusion that it's very difficult to create a system that goes through all these tasks and is accurate. And you can just leave it to his own devices. And I know in that example, he set up sort of emails and flagged certain things that he can go and check it. But it's an interesting conversation to have, especially about the relationship that we will have with artificial intelligence in the future. When you were speaking to these experts, or in your opinion, do you see that as being a gradual process, or do you think that will be just an almost overnight shift, changing their relationship? Because in the book you gave the example of the technologies that we have now, and it was like a 15-year process. It's like a lag. Do you feel like we're going through somewhat of the lag, and in sort of 10 years or less we will experience what people are doing now with the technological progress?
The lag is real, I think. From some of the people that I was speaking to, they were saying that, yeah, obviously sort of mobile phones and things like that were created 15 years before they became mainstream. And I think that is a fair sort of analogy with where AI is at the moment. So a lot of companies that I've spoken to or understand sort of were really interested in deploying AI into their workplaces a few years ago. And I would say that there's research that says that at the moment, or companies that have tried AI have not seen huge benefits or net benefits from this. So I think that we're still at a stage where sort of the use of AI is quite niche and very specific, and sort of narrow is the term that researchers use, because it can do certain things very well, but it can't necessarily do all of the things that we would want it to. And I think that is a process that is gradual. There is still a lot of AI work and research that's going on within laboratories and research institutions. And I think that sort of it's getting to companies in the real world is a slower process. We're starting to see it happening in lots of cases. But to go back to that Google AI research around the eye test that I was talking about a minute ago, I think some of the first sort of medical examples of AI being proven to be able to make accurate medical predictions happened 4 or 5 years ago, if not longer ago. And the real world trials of these haven't quite rolled out yet. So I think that's going to be the same for all areas of work, really. Self-driving cars, we've been promised them for years, and sort of the technology is still in trials. It's still a few years away for everybody to use it. So it'll be a very gradual process, but I do think that there is the chance that it can very much disrupt a lot of industries and a lot of people's work, but it's how we respond to that is something that we need to reflect upon as a society.
Yeah, on the medical front, we had James Temperton to discuss the future of medicine a couple of episodes ago, and it was fascinating discussion that we had about the future of medicine and sort of the personal prescriptive way of medicine and how that go in the future. That seems to me to be an industry that's perhaps at the forefront of actually seeing the benefits of the work and the technology that's been implemented. In that conversation and in that book, he was talking about the example of actually creating one pill for one person based on their own individual issues, which to me is mind-blowing, even if it does cost $500,000 or whatever it might be, which is interesting. On the self-driving thing, I think it was interesting because obviously with Elon Musk at the forefront of the self-driving stuff, I feel like that's more of a mindset shift of the public rather than perhaps the technology itself, because I know from family members and friends, and we have these discussions about self-driving cars, like, would you ever use a self-driving car? And I thought to myself, I would much rather a self-driving car than someone who's had a bad day at work and they're in charge, they're sort of steering the wheel and they're thinking about, for instance, their boss or have to go home or wherever it might be, which made me think about it a bit more, because each one of us experiences that world every time, we leave the door, but we somewhat feel comfortable with it. But when that new technology comes, we also have this aversion to it in the first place, but then we get sort of socialized to it. Do you feel like that's going to be the case as well? It's a lot to take in at first, but then eventually we're all just going to be in self-driving cars on our phones and just loving life.
Yeah, nobody likes change, do they?
Yeah.
I think that's one of the big lessons from everything that we can learn. But I think that it will be a case of society needs to adapt. We need to adapt our mindsets to what we're being presented with, and our own experiences very much reflect what we will consider to be something that is that we're willing to do. If you've been in a car crash where somebody else was driving the car, for instance, that is going to change your experiences to these types of systems and technologies and what's coming around the corner. But I think that, again, it will probably be a bit of a gradual process, understanding that if the technology does work properly as it's supposed to do, it could save a lot of lives within self-driving cars, because it takes away the human element of making mistakes and everything like that. But to get a lot of people into the vehicles, I think will take a sort of like societal change and understanding of the technology and how it works. And obviously we don't have self-driving cars that are in use widely across the world. They're still in testing, but there are sort of autonomous features which are using AI in cars, and Tesla is obviously one of the sort of leading examples of this. And I think that as people see various autonomous features, whether it is lane changing or things like that, they will gradually get used to that, and you'll forget what changing a lane on a motorway was actually like. The next step will be there. So it's a gradual process thing, I think, if people are going to adopt it. But there'll be people that don't want to adopt these types of things, and I think that's the case with any technology, right? If you look at social media again, we've seen sort of like backlashes against that once more about how Facebook and platforms sort of have an impact on the world. There's this learning process that I think we probably will have to go through around the use of AI, as well as pretty much anything new that gets introduced to any element of society.
Yeah, definitely. That learning curve is definitely an interesting one. Something that you touched upon in the book. We had Bianca as well, who wrote the other book on climate change. She came on the podcast as well. We talked about climate change. In that book, the use of these companies and technology companies and their impact on climate change. And I don't think a lot of people think about that. I perhaps didn't think about that much. And in the book, you touched upon how much it takes for these programs and how much energy it takes. How do governments and how do sort of in the UK we have the national grid, but how do infrastructures deal with perhaps the use of these technologies and make sure that they are sustainable with the sort of the climate change push that's happening at the moment?
Big example, which isn't AI, is obviously cryptocurrency and Bitcoin at the moment, and having a bit of a reckoning with sort of its increased surge in popularity again, and sort of the impact that that's having on society. I think that while there are sort of like some parallels with AI, it's obviously not a perfect comparison at all in any way. I think that with AI, to be honest, there were researchers that I was speaking to that said that AI researchers haven't been considerate enough of the environmental impact. When we were talking earlier about sort of throwing huge amounts of data at AI systems, throwing more data means that it takes longer to train a system and for the system to be able to sort of learn from those examples, which means more computer power, which means more overall energy usage. And as well as the sort of like the question of, can you keep throwing data at AI and it keep improving? There is a question about how much do you throw at it, the environmental impact as well. Like, are those tiny 1% gains worth potential damage on the planet? And there is research that's going on that's trying to quantify the amount of energy and damage that training and using any AI has on the planet. And that's something that's probably at it is at a very early stage, but it's sort of in proportion to these systems becoming bigger and faster and more common. In some ways, I'm reassured that there are people looking at this, but I think there is definitely more that needs to be done within the AI community to sort of understand the impact that these systems have on the planet. Probably as with any sort of use of AI and sort of application, when you're thinking about the environmental impact, there needs to be this question of, is it worth it? Is what we're doing worth using all of this energy consumption just to train a model? Is the benefit there? What's the environmental impact assessment on this, basically?
I thought it was interesting because in the book you touched upon the fact that there was an individual who created an artificial intelligence program in order to monitor the CO2 emissions of an artificial intelligence program, which I thought was quite interesting. The fact that you're just creating another program on top of a program to monitor the thing. Perhaps that's just a necessary side effect of this progress, is to understand its wider implications, whether they be, like we were talking, the ethical side of it, the societal, economic, but also the environmental, because obviously that is a big push at the moment. There was an interesting quote that you ended the book with from Professor Ragnar from the University of Bergen, and you said the basic attitude of AI is that it should improve the human condition rather than replace it. And I feel like that was a great way to end the book, because I think a lot of people's fear is that the fact that it will replace us rather than perhaps improve our lives. And I know we touched upon the fact that there's this utopian view that perhaps you can just sit back and relax. And then there's the wider question, perhaps might not be on your mind, but then what is meaning? How do we derive meaning in that situation? But do you feel like there's going to be more people understanding the fact that this technology is here to improve our lives, rather than perhaps replace us with a human-like robot that walks the same way we do, that talks very much like Arnold Schwarzenegger in the Terminator kind of thing? And do you think mindsets are eventually going to move away from that fact to become more open with the possibilities that this intelligence will have?
Yeah, I don't necessarily think that people's general thoughts around that concept of what AI is will change that much. I think that sci-fi, much as I love watching all of the, and reading all the things about killer robot systems or big AI systems or Terminator that will world with AI, I think that that's very much probably sort of ingrained what AI is for people and probably will do for a very long time. Whereas the reality itself is we're obviously a very long way from that sort of thing happening, and that sort of consciousness or generalness, really probably sort of the adoption of AI where people don't know it's there, it's invisible essentially. Lots of the systems that we currently have, so lots of social media, Google search, banking systems, the maps on that we use to navigate on our phone when they're telling us like real-time traffic updates and things like that, lots of that is already sort of powered by AI. I think that because it doesn't really impact us, because the technology is essentially invisible, we don't necessarily need to know or have that much of an opinion of it, which means that, to be honest, in some ways, a lot of the AI that we have now is quite dull. It's quite boring. It just operates, it just works, and that's not going to be replaced quickly, I don't think. And you're still going to have this big idea of people thinking about Terminators and things like that, when in reality, AI is probably going to be impacting their lives on a very regular basis and making their lives hopefully better. That's if people develop it responsibly and we aim for something that is a net benefit to everybody.
The artificial intelligence in an accounting system, no one cares about that. They just want it to work. So I definitely agree on that fact. That's going to be the first place for these systems is impacting financial institutions, and obviously when it comes to regulating data and scanning through documents and uploading knowledge, that kind of stuff. It's not going to have that sort of army of robots kind of a view, especially, well, hopefully not in the near future anyway. That's the idea. Anyway, Matt, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us and discuss your book, Artificial Intelligence: How Machine Learning Will Shape the Next Decade. It was a great conversation, and I think this book is a great primer for anyone wanting to learn more about AI. If they don't already know anything about it, I think this is a great place to come in and sort of get your introduction to that. Where's the best place that people can find you, Matt, on social media?
Twitter is probably best for me, which is at Matt Burgess 1.
Perfect. So if anyone has any further questions for Matt, they can go and message him on Twitter. Thank you, Matt.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content. Also, visit our website, www.booktalktoday.com, to subscribe and download the latest edition of our magazine. Join our mailing list to receive the first issue for free, to get a taste for the value-packed content that we are offering. Book Talk Today, for readers, by readers.